Well, hello. Oh, hello, everyone. I imagine that we will have lots of experts online and people who maybe are just starting out. So I'm going to present a kind of overview and then get into some details and then look at home, farm, and community scale composting. If you have questions along the way, send them to me, call out. If you have questions you think best at the end, I'm going to try and run through this fast enough so that we have a lot of time for Q&A, because that's where a lot of the insights get shared. So what I'm going to do now is share the screen, and we're basically going to just go through some slides. And the first slide, I don't know if people can see this.
Yes, we can see it, David.
Great, thank you. So my wife and I live on 120 acres. You can see Lake Superior in the background. Our land is anywhere from 1 mile to 1.5 miles from Lake Superior. The bottom 40 is our farm where we grow vegetables and produce food. And for 20 some odd years, we delivered up to Cook County through a CSA. And but I also now work for the University of Minnesota as the director of the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships. And we have projects in Cook County and the other counties in Northeast Minnesota around sustainability and around communities, forestry, agriculture, and clean energy. But today we're here to talk about compost. So I'm really excited about the subject, and we're gonna, what are we trying to compost? We're trying to compost materials. You have home compost bins. That's our home compost bin. We have several of them. And then there's institutional compost, restaurant compost, actually materials, food for the compost that can be safely made into soil through the form of compost. So that's part of the ingredients. How do we do this? What do we look at? So, how does compost work? What are the options? And what is the recipe? That's what we're going to go through today. And to start it off, I'm going to be focusing on 4 types of composting. Just a note, these are all aerobic with oxygen composting. I'm not going to be talking about anaerobic composting, but that is another way to transition these materials into a soil amendment. So as you think about the options, I'm going to be sharing these 4: vermiculture composting, worms; hot composting, that's the thermophilic composting and soldier fly larva composting, and livestock composting. And I'm going to focus my attention on the hot compost approach. But to start off with, vermicomposting is using worms. Worms to break down the material, but it's primarily the red worm. And there are some challenges now because as with these packets of worms, sometimes there's other species involved. And so that's something to be really, really cautious about, especially with the new jumping worm coming on. So as you're looking for options, make sure you only get the red wigglers that are designed for high organic matter. So they don't tend to do too well. They often die around the pile, the species, because they really need high level organics. So anyway, that is one option. But do it with caution, and you cannot compost meat typically with it. Now, in some areas, we use it, and it works really well. It breaks the material down. It makes a nice potting soil. One farm I worked on in the tropics, they just did it outside. That's one of the considerations, the temperature for the worms. And so vermicomposting is one option, but we also have our winters, and our challenge is to get a population of those worms through the winter. I'm actually going to start one in our greenhouse attached to our house and then overwinter them there to run a cycle inside the greenhouse. So vermicomposting is one option. There are
David?
bins you can buy. Yeah, question.
I'm just going to interrupt you real quick. Your share screen little buttons, I guess, show at the very top of the screen.
Yeah, what's that about?
And I didn't know, sometimes it cuts off some of your text on your slides.
Let me try sharing one more time, but I was wondering whether.
You might have your mouse over that area.
Okay.
And that
Yeah.
might do it.
And you can move that bar down too.
Okay, if I can grab it. Okay, let me grab it to the bottom, but then if you hover around, it'll go away.
There you go.
Yeah,
That's better at least.
That's a little better. Yeah.
Okay, we'll see what it interrupts later on.
Okay. All right.
So
Thank you.
there are units that can work for vermicomposting. This square one's used in Silver Bay schools. They do an extensive vermicomposting there. And there are ones that work. So it can be very contained and very orderly, but insects and bugs are a challenge. The liquid that comes off needs to be drained off, again, to make it livable for the earthworms. Another process is soldier fly larva composting. And soldier fly larva composting is a challenge because these guys like warmth. And to reproduce, they need about 85 degrees, which is good in that they're not going to live in our environment if they happen to escape. But it also makes it challenging to run a system that works. But they're pretty awesome because they'll do veggies and meat. I worked on it with an aquaponic project looking at flies and fish feed. So the larva was used to feed the fish, and this is them in their breeding chamber. And then you let them go into a bin and you cover the bin with cardboard, and the adults will burrow into the cardboard cracks, as you can see, and then lay the eggs, and then the eggs pop out and go back into the bin. So it's a really nice cycle. But again, you need a kind of a separate system for the flies to do reproduction. You need about 85 degrees for that system. So it's an option, but it's a challenging option. There are commercial operations for it, but most people build their own. So worms, soldier fly composting, those are two of the three. This one's coming up is a really fun one. Livestock composting. This is a farm in Pennsylvania. And basically, what he does is he uses livestock. So he has 3 bins. He uses pigs, chickens. And so basically he rotates the pigs and then the chickens, and they go back and forth. He will run a bar down into the material needing composting, and he'll pour cracked corn. We used to do that when we were clearing fields with pigs. And the pigs will burrow down all the way to the bottom of that hole to get to the corn. And in the process, they're mixing the pile. And then because it's not a hot system, there's a lot of seed still in there. And then they run the chickens over the seed, over the area, and they pluck out and eat the seeds. So there's less weeds in the end result. The challenge is pigs will eat chickens. And so on this farm, he has a chute that once the pigs get to one section, he moves them back to the middle, and then the chickens climb over to the third bin and they rotate back and forth that way. So this is an interesting way of composting using animals to do all of your work. And finally, our main feature is hot composting, thermophilic. And so what we're looking at is using heat to break down these materials to create a good weed-free compost. See that pile steaming? That's what you want to see. And it'll get a sweet smell going. So you need materials. and we'll talk about the components. What do you need? What do you need to live as a human? Air. Okay, all of you right now, on the count of 3, taking a deep breath and hold it as long as possible. Ready? 1, 2, 3. So how important is air to you? You can maybe make 3 minutes without dying. So air is very important in these thermophilic systems because we need air to live, but more importantly, who needs the air? The bacteria, the good bacteria that break it down. So that's three minutes you can live without air. Water, 3 days. Water is very important. Food, 3 weeks. We all need shelter of one kind. And guess what? We actually do need bacteria in our guts and other places. Just the good ones. And so that's what we need. And guess what your compost pile needs? It needs the same thing, but their shelter is just the right temperature. So they have different requirements than we do. And so those are the things you really need to think about. Air in your pile. How do you incorporate air into your composting pile? How much water? Do you cover it to keep the rain from it? Do you add water? Trying to get a good balance of water so it's not too wet where it becomes anaerobic and then it'll start to stink, or not too dry where the bacteria is starving for water in their systems to do their work. Food, what are you feeding it? What is the food stocks? In this case, this looks like rhubarb. So the big challenge with the food is what you're looking for is a 30-to-1 ratio between the high carbon material and the nitrogen materials. So look at sawdust, 150 to 200 to 1. So when you have sawdust as a compost pile, is that going to compost very easily? No, because that ratio is not there. So you'll need to add some high nitrogen parts to it, like legumes or grass clippings or fresh garden supplies, green parts, all that green stuff going into the pile to get the balance between peat moss or sawdust, cow manures, and the manures are also high nitrogen content. So what you're trying to do is mix the ingredients so you end up with a 30-to-1 ratio with these piles. So one of you mentioned before we started the night, the pile's not really working. So what is the carbon nitrogen ratio? And so we'll talk more about this in the food that the pile needs. Temperature. You can see in this thermometer, this is a composting thermometer. From 100 to 130 is called active. That's where you want it to get going. You know it's beginning to cook when you're getting into that range. But then what you really want to do is get up to the 140. At the 140, you start getting rid of all of the weed seeds so that when that compost is applied to your garden bed or to your fields, you're not ending up with everything people ate. Interesting story. Without that temperature, what human waste will create when it is laid out from these plants and stuff, what will grow are tomatoes, because almost everyone eats tomatoes and those seeds go in, that gelatin coat, which is actually a growth inhibitor, gets broken down in your body and then it comes out as tomatoes, seeds, viable tomato seeds. So temperature is very important to kind of break that cycle because it will kill those seeds. And then, of course, the bacteria are the basis of which. And usually you don't have to do anything. Usually I'll add soil in the different layers of the compost pile or soils from the previous compost piles interwoven into the mix so that the bacteria are readily available to consume that pile more quickly. So for the home composting scale, there can be all sorts of things. Someone mentioned a 3-bin system. Someone tries to do it in 1. You've got these roller things. The whole concern and challenge with that is to create that right ratio and to create that temperature. And so smaller scale home composting is the most challenging level of composting. The more easier composting levels is at the farm scale or the community scale, because having the right mixture of the material and the right amount at the same time to have that dynamic to create that heat is also challenging. So if you're throwing a banana peel and you're throwing a lettuce head onto a pile every so often, it's much harder to make that compost dynamic and working to get all of those factors together. Not impossible at all, because if you can get those temperatures, if you can get the moisture in the air, it will work. But home scale is the most challenging and the most done. And again, really work on that ratio. Can anyone look at this pile down here? How much, it looks like leaves and like wood chips. How likely is this to compost? The ratio's off. Here's a lot of leaves. So here's some manure, and here, this one seems to be breaking down really good. So what is the ratio? Get an idea and try and map that out. Compost piles might look like this. You got a couple bins along the back, and that's going to take a while to compost, right? So how do you mix it together? How do you get those leaves that are hanging in the air in contact with the soil and the bacteria breaking down? So that's all part of the process. What do they need to look like to compost? And then we mentioned bears. This is in Argentina, where my family, we went down and taught at a school and built a composting system. Their problem with dogs. And so dogs roam that country every night. And so every compost pile was just ravaged at night. So this was an attempt to put them in barrels, make the right carbon ratio, and then roll them to help aerate. And there's holes drilled into them. But I would say it became anaerobic. One, it's very warm in Argentina at that time. And it also wasn't enough holes to make enough air through. And that became the challenge. So air, again, any one of those components is out of balance, you're going to have a hard time or bad results from your compost. But you can build your own. You can buy one that works for you. But those components, air, water, temperature, carbon ratio, the food stock, and then the bacteria are all essential to get in harmony together to get that active composting going. So at the farm scale composting, we have a lot more food, products. And so, but every one of those lettuces that we grow, the outer leaves get taken off. They got a bite in them, anything like that. Any slugs that come off, they come off. And so that's something to consider. That's what produces so much product as we prepare the food for sale. And so in a typical harvest, when we were in full steam, we'd probably get 10 large wheelbarrows full of materials from the plants that we would then compost each week. So the whole level's different, and that enables a much more dynamic opportunity. So farm scale, we've been weeding and digging beds. You can see the green stuff on the right, the composting stuff on the left, and we will mix that all through the year so that by the fall it's done, and then it'll sit or get applied at that point onto the fields. So a lot of materials on farms. In this case, we're using humans to bring all that material together. But guess what? I don't really want to move that pile again because it takes a lot of time. So it becomes stagnant after a while. It gets heated up. It does its 140 thing. It starts to steam, but the outside stuff stays uncomposted because we've been using people power. And, I want to respect how much we use of it. And the different size of pile, what I'm trying to do is get as square a pile as possible so that you get the least amount of surface area to the most amount of material. And that's what's really challenging. So if you have a really low one, it's going to be hard to get it heat. If you have a long, narrow one, which you can't really do, it's going to be hard to get the heat up. Some of those barrels have those challenges because there's air around it, and our air isn't warm enough. So that dynamic has to happen from the inside only, not just the inside and the air. We now move our compost, those same piles now, we use our electric tractor that's powered by our solar to flip the piles. And it's working great. 33 years, we've been doing it by hand. Now we're using the electric tractor, and wow, what a break on how it's done. The Wolf Ridge Farm, they bring in materials, that's wood chips, and then they have the food scraps at volume mixed, and then they build their piles in layers. There's a nice pile between the kitchen and the pizza oven timber frame built at North House. And then they educate students about how to build a pile, and then they layer it, and then that pile becomes mature. They can spread it on the fields, or in this case, they grew pumpkins in it, and they harvested pumpkins after it had composted. So that's a really great, pumpkins really need a rich soil, or it really thrive on that. So that's a great opportunity for your old compost pile, or in a bed that's filled with good composting. So just a note, human compost, it's not approved to be anywhere in our country. So figure out that to be used in a non-human consumptive place. So we've looked at home composting, and I'm looking for the Q&A to really get into that in greater detail. And then we're looking at farm scale, where the scale is just that much better and bigger, and we can create the piles all at once with the materials that have been gathered. Now we're going to briefly look on a community level compost system that we're working on in East Lake County. It's called the Ei Roskaa, No Rubbish Recycling Compost Project. I'm going to do this briefly because I want to get back to your home composting questions, but to give you an idea at this level, what we're looking at. What is the challenge we're facing here in Cook and Lake County and the other Northeast counties is the Moccasin Mike landfill will be full by 2026. You know what's going to happen when it has to travel farther. It's going to cost more to get rid of our waste, not to mention environmental, all these others. It's just going to cost our pocketbook more. And we have limited recycling access throughout most of rural Minnesota, including the Northeast. What we're hoping this will do is increase food production by having more compost and fertilizer, because we don't have enough compost with the increasing number of farms in Lake and Cook County. We don't have enough manure. So we can generate that ourselves by composting our food scraps. And we also can provide a more long-term option by building this facility. So this is a model test facility that we're looking at. We're looking at population in Lake County of about 10,000, what's Cook's just under 6,000. And so your numbers would be very similar in terms of the amount of pollution. But remember, we have the tourists that come, eat, all the restaurants. So we have a much greater number that our waste represents. In Lake County, we produce about 7,600 tons, and about 20% is recycled, 77% is landfilled. And of that, that's landfilled, about 30% is organic waste. So that's what we're trying to tap into and figure out how to take out of the waste stream to help with the numbers on this. So 1,800 tons, East Lake County is about a third. So we're looking at 612 tons of food scraps, and our project should pull out about 200 tons. And we'll see how it goes. The idea is to build these smaller model community composting closer to the source to figure out how to pull this waste out of the stream. So that's what we're looking at. So current numbers are in orange. 77% is the current amount we're landfilling. 21% is what we're composting. Maybe you're doing better in Cook County. And what we want to do is move that composted recycled material up and move the landfill down. And hopefully people aren't burning and dumping the garbage, and that 2% will represent all the new home composters that are online doing their part and pulling that and creating that resource. Of the composted stuff, we're going to be 14% composting, 30% diversion, and 5%, 5% diversion and 30% more of the traditional composting. We can compost 75% of our waste stream. So we got to figure out how to do this. In Europe, it's 85, 90%. So we've got to figure out a better way to do this. I knew there was this grant, so I got a couple students over the last couple of years to work with me to look at the parts of building a system. So there's a collection system, the technology, the social considerations, the physical structures, and the economics. All of these pertain to your home and your farm, but this is at that community level. So what does it mean at that level? And the social conditions. Curbside collection, really expensive in rural, although most of your population, or much of it, is in Grand Marais. One stream sorting, not happening much in our region, certainly in rural. Partnering with high waste, yeah, we can do that. The restaurants, the schools, and then we can create a community collection site. So that's the conditions we're looking at, how we'll do this. But we also have to, where is this going to be located? How are we going to educate so people use it right and people know how to use it? And tourists who visit don't dump their garbage at the gate. How do we make it work? And then identifying the current sites that have the organic matter that need composting. So again, different things. We chose the thermal. I did then write a grant with the Lake County Solid Waste Group. And we did get a $325,000 grant from the MPCA, along with our township money and in-kind work, the county big lift on support, and other nonprofits and community groups. We have a $336,000 budget. We're just starting now to identify location in these, but we have identified the technology. And I'm going to do this real quick. We're going to power this greenhouse system. It'll be done in a greenhouse with an electric tractor. This one will be a grade higher than the one we had. And you can see these electric tractors are real now. They didn't exist. We bought the 144th electric tractor from this. So you can see that that's now an option. What will that tractor pull? It'll pull a side composter that basically goes through the pile and aerates. What is it doing? It's doing the exact same thing we just talked about. Air, food stocks, combinations, temperature. Look at that steam coming off that pile. That's exactly what we're looking to do at this facility. So we'll be doing that next. Oh, let me go back. So what this facility will look like is a big greenhouse with two of those long rows. The tractor will drive through with that aerating side composting machine, drive through the door and go hit the other pile. Off the side or connected will be a classic recycling center, but also a cardboard and paper shredding. Because remember that cardboard, paper is a high carbon source. So instead of shipping it somewhere where it may or may not get recycled, we're going to be gathering the cardboard and using it as our carbon for the food scraps. So that's kind of a cool option. And it will be 100% solar powered. We have that in the budget to make this an electric powered greenhouse, solar powered community composting facility. So what's going on? Less waste, pulling the 200 tons of food waste off, which is a savings just on the cost to drop it off at the landfill is $10,000. But there'll also be savings in trucking and labor and all the reduced loads and gas. And then with having a permanent recycling center, we hope to pull off 348 tons. Some of that will significantly reduce the tipping fee. And then we'll also divert materials to Lake County demolition landfill, like cinder blocks. They don't need to be landfilled. And then the addition of resources, organic fertilizer. And that's what I want to end on with you today, is what does this mean to our communities to have this community composting potential? So within 2 years, we should have this. On our farm, we compost, we grow plants with it. Compost is an essential, fundamental part of building soil. And it's that added that can grow an incredible amount of food in a very, very small space. So we grow lots and lots of food from compost, from manures and all that. Compost is very important. The best source we can have that we can grow food with in our communities, in our gardens, on our farms. And so I'll leave you with that. Compost is important to grow soils and plants. And I'm hoping there's a lot of expertise out there. We can learn from each other, ask questions, bounce ideas around. So there you have it, an onslaught of thoughts and ideas.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. So someone did have I don't know, Kat, if you maybe want to talk about that question that I had sent over to you about the community composting. That's an option too, or if people have questions they want to bring up right away.
Yeah, sure. The only and correct me if I'm wrong, because I am still pretty new to the community, but the only community composting that I know of in town in Grand Marais is if you belong to the community garden at the Cook County Community Center. And if you pay for a plot there, you get to use the composting facility there. Otherwise, I'm not aware of any actual like community composting option, but there is, I just shared it to the group chat, and it's called sharewaste.com. And it's also an app. It's extremely popular. If you click on it, I could share my screen too, just to show it, but it is it shows a huge map, and it'll show folks that are interested in taking compost or that would like someone to take their compost, and they'll give specifics of what they're interested in, like what kind of food waste they want to take from folks. So right now in Grand Marais, our area, we have one farm that's on share waste, and that's Maple Hill, and they'll take compost happily. Just they don't want eggshells, for example, in their compost because their chickens are present. And for anyhow, if you look at like Duluth or Minneapolis, it's a really awesome and interactive system where someone, say you're a renter and you don't have the space to compost, just don't have the means. You can collect your food waste still inside, and then you can go ahead and drop it off to your neighbor or someone in your community who would happily take your food waste and utilize it and still make something out of it. And that's something that I thought would be an awesome opportunity for our community to know more about, so we can utilize it, since we don't have an actual composting program for our community. But it's a really great opportunity for us to kind of join forces. So if you have a great garden, a great composting system at your home, and you're interested in getting some from people in town who don't have the space, it's free and very easy to use. So I just wanted to open that up to the community. But otherwise, I believe North Shore Waste is open over the next few years to potentially start a commercial composting program, but that is brand new and in the works. So I can't really divulge any more information on that, but yeah, that's all I know.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Can I add to what you said?
Yeah, yeah.
My understanding is that up at the recycling center, anybody can drop off materials to be composted. And I, in the past, have just pulled up with my pickup truck and hauled away buckets full of compost also.
Okay.
They take green waste, so they don't take food waste. So they take like leaves and things like that. And
So like yard waste is
Yard
the only
waste,
acceptable thing. Okay, so no food waste at the recycle center. Okay,
Yeah.
Great.
I have a question, if I can ask a question. of
Yeah, go
David.
for it.
So David, can we get these temperatures, the higher temperatures, without using manure, as long as we get the ratio of plant materials?
Yep. The ratio is the key. Grass clippings are probably the best and easiest way to get that higher nitrogen, more intense amount. You can do it without manure, but you do have to get that ratio, which is harder without manure, but not impossible, especially with food waste and other things that have that ratio. Because food waste, garden waste is anywhere from 12 to 20 to 1, and we need 30. So that'll help build that nitrogen into it. Grass clippings are 15 to 1. So that'll help. Manure is 20 to 1. So So anything within that ratio, you can make compost piles without manure. It's much easier and much better with, but that's not everyone's reality. And we don't have enough anymore. We've cut back on our livestock and we really miss it.
Okay, thanks for answering that question. So it looks like we have a few more questions popping up in chat. So one person asked, how can we avoid attracting critters to our home composting?
Well, one way is to reduce the smell, and that's to keep it aerobic, and to keep it mixed and keep it non-smelling. People have those rolling, barrels. That helps. Wolf Ridge for years had a problem because the bears kept coming and messing with it. I did experiments when we first got here 34 years ago. I made my first compost piles, one with bear poop and one without bear poop. And they both had moose poop. There was so much moose poop here. A lot's changed. And the bears ripped up both piles. So bear poop in compost piles is not a diverter for them. So keep it aerated, fence it, dogs, and any physical structure is really important. Now mice and stuff, they're looking for food. Again, if it's warm, you might get some visitors curling up on the edge. And stuff like that in the fall. So, but generally just hygiene and barriers, and then keeping it aerated will reduce.
Wonderful. Thanks for answering that. So we have a bunch more questions. So I'm just going to do one by one here. So another one had brought up the eggshell comment about wondering, they've heard that this is dangerous, and have heard if you don't bake them before composting them. Can you address that, if that's accurate or not? So if you bake them in the oven?
Well, if you do your compost pile right, they will bake to 140. And so that's the challenge. I haven't heard much negative about eggshells. In fact, we put our eggshells on our soil in the fall of next year's tomato crop. And it says delay in fruiting can one of the delays is lack of calcium. So having calcium in the soil, which eggshells are a lot, and it can help bring in a slightly earlier crop. So again, if you're able to get your compost pile up to the temperatures, not a problem. If you're concerned about it, yeah, you could put them in an oven on the way. But again, we can come up with solutions that don't create other environmental problems, like using gas or something to heat something, the better. So, and that's what a good compost pile will do. And one of the things you could do is try and keep your ingredients separate and build them up enough, challenge on a small scale, and then put them all together at once. And then you'll get that dynamic aspect, and you got the greens and the browns and everything put together.
Interesting. Okay. Next question is, what is the ratio of dry leaves that should be in the mix?
Well, leaves are anywhere from 40 to 60 to 1. So it'd be like 2 parts leaves, or, and if you had something that was pure nitrogen. So then you have to figure out, maybe it's 4 parts leaves and 8 parts vegetable, or 8 parts grass clippings. But again, grass clippings can get bound up, right? They can get stuck together. So mixing them in layers and stuff, so it gets incorporated, so that they have contact between all the little grasses and the soils. Otherwise, it'd become a mat, and that's a problem. And that's a challenge. So again, layering it with thin layer grass, more stuff, thin layer grass, more stuff, or being able to mix it, one of those rollers. Those are all things to keep that you want it all connected in this community of excitement by all the different parts.
All right, next question is, they say, I use alfalfa meal as a nitrogen source. Do you have a comment on this?
Great. And that's another way you can increase that ratio. Say you're just heavy on on leaves and you don't have a lot of nitrogen, you can add direct nitrogen. We use blood meal, which is dried blood from slaughterhouses, as our nitrogen fertilizer for our crops. So there are lots of different nitrogen sources that you can also layer into it that will greatly help. And sometimes your pile like gets cold and there's still a bunch of stuff to compost. What is the way to resurrect that pile? It's add nitrogen and get it mixed in. And then if you add enough and it gets mixed enough, it'll all of a sudden you start to smell that sweet smell and it'll start to get warm, and it'll finish off the pile. So typically nitrogen's tough, right? It's negatively charged, which means it runs right through the pile really quickly, and it runs through your soils quickly because soils are negatively charged. They polarize each other. And so you really want to capture the nitrogen, but that's the first thing to leach out in rains and such. So that's why you want to balance. You don't want too much water because it'll leach the nitrogen out, because the water will grab the nitrogen and push it through. Whereas phosphorus and potassium and calcium, those are positively charged, and they'll grab some things along the way and get stuck there magnetically. So there's a lot of different dynamics. There's chemistry, there's physics, there's biological, and then there's the whole physics with magnetic fields, which is really fun. It's kind of cool to learn about.
All right, next question. Let's see. This person asks, I'm interested in biochar, char. I'm assuming char. Okay. If you add some to the pile, does it affect the ratio and or heat, etc.?
It won't do much for the dynamics of the pile. It is a higher pH, and that'll add, and that's something to consider, is the pH of materials. You know, like wood chips is very acid, typically, depending on wood chips around here are very acid. And so it will affect the pH a little, but it also has a high cation exchange, CET it's called, which is that ability to grab the positive ions that are going through the pile, like phosphorus and potassium and calcium. So that's really important. Biochar is, think of biochar more like a sponge than a fire in that system. And when I've done research on biochar in our fields at Wolf Ridge on pH adjustment, the biochar and the ash together was the best combination, better than biochar and lime, and better than biochar alone. Biochar alone doesn't do much. Again, it's the sponge. You have to get it incorporated. So have it incorporated into a compost pile is great. And that'll really stimulate, they'll get charged, they'll get filled with all those nutrients that it's grabbing, and then they'll be able to release them in the soil over time as the plants need. So biochar is a good thing to have in your compost pile if you can, and in your field. And all biochar is, you know, that stuff when you're done making a campfire, those chunks left, charcoal we call them, that's biochar. That's charcoal, but when you add it to soil or compost, it's biochar. It's become part of the biological systems. That's why it's called biochar. Now, the stuff you do in your grill, they mix that charcoal with coal. So the grill stuff, unless you do the natural stuff, which is really cool, has other amendments in it that make that charcoal a cooking coal. It's different.
Okay. Thank you. Next question asks, are there some types of leaves that are better than others?
Yes, and that goes with needles or leaves, right? And I think for me, since compost is so helpful and organic matter is so important, I'll take anything, but you might want to consider what you're adding with it. So if I were like, we're chipping now our spruce and fir, right? Because we're clearing it and making a firewall around our farm, and we're clearing a bunch of spruce and fir. And on that electric tractor, we're chipping up to 3-inch trees with it. So we're getting lots of chips. Now, those are going to be more acidic. And so I would put ash in layers in that as you're building the pile. Ash is a higher pH, and now it offset. So at the very least, at the time you're done, when you're adding it to it, know that it may be more acidic. And if it's blueberries, great, you're adding it to blueberries. But if it's a high pH loving plant, or like raspberries or brassicas, you'll want to recognize that and make sure you make amendments to make the pH more optimal for the growth of those crops.
Okay. I'm not sure if you had already answered this one or not. The question is, what is the CN ratio of leaves, not the ratio in the entire pile?
Well, the leaves generally of, like, from maple as example, is about 50-1. So pine needles as an example is 70-1. Okay, so you have to add a lot more nitrogen to get right. Pine needles, they don't break down that much. You see on the floor, they just don't break down as much. And that's the acid, that's the lack of nitrogen involved with it ratio. So you'll need to add like a little bit more green stuff and nitrogen to a pine needle pile as opposed to a maple pile leaf or even chips.
Yeah, okay. This is a good one for right now because it's growing so wildly right now. Can rhubarb leaves be composted? Concerns with the size and the chemicals that are in these leaves.
We compost everything. And yeah, they're a great consideration. I also, on our scale, we pull the stem and I just chop the thing off right there and make a big pile of leaves. I put the rhubarb in our wheelbarrow, and then I'll actually lay the leaves around the base of it. So far, no negative effects. But you can compost anything organic. If all you have is rhubarb and you have no food scraps, that might need, might want to chop it up. And all of these will benefit by getting it into smaller units, right? Because what does that do? Increase the amount of surface area. Otherwise, you got one surface area and a big rhubarb leaf. But if you chop it up, each one of those has sides, just like Maine has a 2,000-mile coastline because it's jagged all the way up. And so that's what you're trying to do, is break it down as much as possible. So some people will chip things as they go into the compost pile. That just makes it more dynamic. But anything's possible. I have no problem composting rhubarb leaves as well. We do both because we have so many.
Yeah. Next one is, do you have any comments on the compost available from Western Superior Sewer District? I've had bad luck with it. It's stunted my plants.
Interesting. We've used Western Lake Superior compost. In fact, the person we're getting the grant from at the MPCA started that program. So we have some good expertise there. I haven't heard of growth challenges with it. So I'm wondering about the soil underneath it and pH and things like that. But something to consider, it's not considered organic because they compost the plates, the biodegradable plates and stuff. And even though those are largely made with corn or other organic materials, there's little particles that connect them together that are more in that plastic family. And so technically, the WLSSD compost cannot be used if you're certified organic or growing organically. And so at our facility in Finland, we're going to take the biodegradable plates and stuff, but we're going to do a separate pile with the tractor and the front loader for those. And we're going to do the majority of our compost with the organic standards, which will not have those things in it. Now that's different for paper plates and pizza boxes. We'll be able to compost those, and that meets the organic standards. So as for why things didn't grow, I would say it might be the amended soil with it or a particular batch that was unusual, because I haven't heard any real negatives for growth on with the WLSSD. Finland Community Garden just got a whole load for that, and that's how they built their beds, and it looked pretty good to me. But what is the soil underneath? What is the pH? Because When I started the Wolf Ridge Farm, the pH was 3.8. 3.2 is lemon juice. And so nothing will grow at 3.8. In fact, we looked at the arthropods in the soil. There was almost nothing living in that soil at that pH. And so if you have good compost on top of that soil, the roots are going to go right to that soil and they're going to stop. They won't grow, and there certain nutrients won't be available. And so I would, again, if there's any concern with growth, check your pH and see what's going on there.
Okay. I'm wondering if we have just a few more questions, but I know we wanted to leave some time for Kat to talk too. So why don't we go with just one more question, and then you'll take it over, Kat. Just want to respect people's time here if they do need to leave right at 1 o'clock. So the next one here says, I use a gallon bucket to collect food scraps. I throw a handful of torn up egg cartons in the bottom and fill the rest with food scraps. And then I dump it on the pile. Does that sound like a reasonable ratio?
It sounds good to me. That we'll be playing with exactly that in the community level. I mean, because what you've done, you've added some nice carbon, a high carbon to a low carbon. It's a nice approach. So congrats. They also make good fire starters too, though, the egg cartons. So
yeah. All right. Okay. I'm going to leave it over to Kat. If you have a few things you want to say about CCLEP.
Yeah, sure. I'll be pretty brief. Thank you, everyone. First and foremost, thank you so much, David, again, for presenting today. We're super grateful up here in Cook County. We've been really wanting this presentation to happen, so we're thrilled to have you give us some time of yours to share your wealth of knowledge with our community. So Cook County Local Energy Project, we're a small nonprofit based up here in Grand Marais in Cook County, and we've been collaborating with Cook County Higher Education to put together various workshops and webinars that the community has been really interested in hearing more about. So we have a few more awesome presentations coming up this month that we have local presenters in our community that will be sharing their knowledge with us. So on June 21st, we'll have a low waste lifestyle 101 class from noon to 1 p.m. with Laura. I'm sorry, that's 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. I apologize. With Laura Durenberger-Gunrow. And then June 28th, we'll have a recycling basics in Cook County with Christina Matson, who's on here right now, from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. She's with Zero Waste Cook County. So we're really excited about having those happen, and those are also free of charge. So if you have a chance, please join us. Otherwise, they'll also be recorded, and we'll be providing those online. So whenever you want to jump and access them, they will be at your fingertips. And yeah, so, CCLEP, we do a lot for our community, but our main thing is we facilitate an equitable and sustainable transition toward locally controlled, resilient, low carbon energy produced in Cook County. We act to guide our county away from reliance on fossil fuels, and we strive to make this shift with renewable energy and other energy efficient solutions to become a more just and energy self-reliant community. And so with that, composting, low waste lifestyle, learning how to recycle, but also how to reduce how we consume. And, all those things are interrelated. They all kind of connect and interweave themselves with energy. So a lot of these things are really important to CCLEP, and we want to educate and share this knowledge as much as we can with our communities, so we can all, have as much resources at our fingertips. So that's a little bit about us. If you ever have any questions on how to be more energy efficient in your home or your business, if you're interested in resources on home weatherization, energy audits, climate-friendly heating, going solar, where there's EV charging stations in Cook County, yada, yada, the list goes on. I am here to help. Cook County Local Energy Project is here to answer a lot of your questions. And if we don't have the answers, we will get those answers for you. We're going to be going over a pretty big website revamp over the next few months to get a lot more resources available to our community. So stay on the lookout. But for now, we have a lot already there for you to access. And I'll drop our website in the chat right now. So if you ever want to take a look at that, feel free. And this is our email, our website, cookcountylocalenergy.org. And if you ever want to go ahead and email me with any types of questions, I will also go ahead and share my email right now with you. And yeah, if you're interested in joining our newsletter, we'll be sharing that pretty frequently, just with upcoming free webinars to, just kind of other happenings of like, did you know something, new with heating solutions, maybe some just general things for easy DIY fixes you can do at home that are low cost that can also help you really save a lot of money for heating and other things like that. And with that, that's all I have to say. We've got 2 minutes. If anyone wants to ask another question, otherwise we can kind of just jump off here. And thanks again for everyone's time. Really appreciate everyone dropping in for this hour.
Yeah, me as well. We had a pretty large group, so wonderful. And thank you, David, again for your wonderful presentation. And and Kat and CCLEP for partnering with us to do this. This is fantastic. So hope to see several of you next week. All right.
Thanks,
Okay,
everyone. Thanks
Bye-bye.
again, David. Have a great day.